Now let's talk about nested macros. There are a couple of different forms of nested macros. Form 1 is a form where we create the first macro, say call it M1, and then we mend it. We write some code here, and then finish it off, mend. Then we create macro 2, say, macro M2, and then we write some code, say, and then we can call that first macro %M1 while we're still inside the second macro, and then we can mend it. So it's a little bit more powerful than what we've done before. Another form of nested macro, I'm going to call it form 2, is where we create an outer macro, call it M1, and then maybe we write some lines of code, and then while we're still inside of this M1 macro, we define macro M2 and write some lines of code, and then say we mend it, and then we call it while we're still in this first macro. We can call M2 and then mend that outer macro M1. So there are a couple of different forms for doing different things. One of the most powerful things that you can do with this is use variables from the outer macro in the inner macro. So you can do different things with this kind of macro than you could with regular macros. So here's an example that just kind of illustrates this. These are 5 different examples, A, B, C, D, and E. They all do the same thing. This first one is just 2 separate macros. So the idea is we're going to create some random normal variables with mean and mu, this macro variable mu, standard deviation SD, and the size of the data set, the n, is going to be this size variable. So here we create this stuff, and then in the next macro we're just going to get some statistics. The only reason to have these variables here is that that's part of the title: mean, mu, standard deviation, SD, and sample size and size. So I'll go ahead and show you what happens when I run this. I'm going to call both of those single macros that I just wrote. Here's the x variable, and then we've got a mean. The next example just puts it all in one macro for us, so it's a little bit different, but same idea. You can just go ahead and put everything in one. I'm just going to create the data set here, and then I've got a couple of titles, run a proc print, run a proc means. So I'm not going to run that, but that's the idea. And then the example C is that form 1, where we create the outer macro. Here we go. We can create this macro stat. Excuse me, this is the inner macro we're creating. So we create the inner macro, and then we mend it. So then we're done. And then we start in on the outer macro. That's where we're going to create this data set, and then we're going to go back and call this statistics macro that'll give us the proc means, and then we'll mend this thing. And so then when we call CG norm, it'll do everything at once for us because the first macro was called in the inner in the second macro. So it can save you some time. This is another way of doing the same thing. This time we've got a little bit different variable call here. So I'm running this with mu p, SDP, and size p, so that when I call the this stat macro down here, I'm going to define mu p to be and mu, which is the mu variable that we define when we call this GE norm macro. So when I suppose I were to call GE norm right here, %GE norm, and then I could say mu equals 5, and SD is 0.3, and size is 2, say. So what it's going to do is it's going to take this 5 and plug it in here. So this is going to be a 5, this is going to be a 3, this is going to be a 2, and then it'll run through here. We're going I equals 1 to 2, and then X is 5 plus 0.3 times this standard normal random variable. And then I'm going to do that, and then I'm going to call this stat macro, and then I'm going to call it with variable mu p equals the value that we plugged in for and mu, which was 5. So I'm going to come back up here, call this macro. In this title, mean is going to be 5. So it's a little bit different way of calling these variables. If you want to use the same variables in the inner macro that you use in the outer macro, you're going to have to use different variable names so that SAS won't confuse itself. Here's an example of a Form 2 macro where we create the inner macro while we're still inside the outer macro. So I created this outer macro gen norm, and then I went ahead and created the data set, and then I'm going to create the second macro where we're running the proc print and proc means. Then I'm going to call that second macro while I'm still in this macro, in the outer macro, the generated norm macro. So then when I call this thing, let me go ahead and run all of this through SAS. It's just going to run it just as smoothly as ever. And so the point of all of this macro creation is that now I can go ahead and call this macro for lots of different sizes. I can call it for tiny data sets and larger data sets and different means and standard deviations. So if I need to run some simulations in SAS, macros can be one of the best things for that.